Eric.
Are you talking to me?
Oh, I'm talking to Trexler. What's going on, Trexler? You're looking great, man.
What's up? Thanks. I've been working on my beard. It looks like you've been doing some work yourself.
Yeah, it does not look nearly as good as yours, but I'm out here trying. This actually represents about 3 months. And Helms, just to be the contrarian that I know my friend is, he's clean shaven. If you're actually not on the video on the old YouTubes, let me describe it for you. Clean shaved. Okay, can't see one wisp of hair. What's going on?
I'm well as well. And the beauty of contest prep is that everything slows down. And this is a future segue, or at least foreshadowing. Basal metabolic rate might slow down. Other things slow down. I've noticed my hair growth even slows down. My frequency of shaving at a certain point actually reduces, just to show how amazing the body's adaptations are and how ridiculous bodybuilding is.
Trex.
Helms, I was going to say, one of the things that just blows my mind is how rarely I have to trim my fingernails when I'm prepping, which is kind of a gross detail. Fingernails are gross, but yeah, it's insane. Your body's just like, yeah, you're still alive, but only barely.
That's right.
Wow. I mean, it's funny you bring up fingernails. Our backup plan to finally make iron culture profitable is to sell the shaved clippings of Helms's, from contest prep for research purposes only, on not OnlyFans, but some sort of analogous place, right? Because we already said, guys, we're not going to do OnlyFans, but we have plans within plans how to make this. Like, people ask us, Trex, all the time, like, guys, this costs you several $1,000s a year. You could have sponsors. You choose not to. How are you going to make it profitable? And that's not even our best idea, to be honest. And you might think to yourself, that's a terrible idea, but it's not even the best. There's several.
We're leveraging scarcity, because I have to trim my nails less. There's less nail trimmings. There's always an interest. All I got to do is check my DM requests. And now there's less trimmings to be sold. So sponsors sell nail trimmings. These are the business type of decisions that we make in our boardrooms here at Iron Culture. So yeah, that's right.
Trexler, let me tell you something that my faith in humanity was temporarily lost yesterday when we had world-class athlete and the homie, as we said, Jess Bittner, over at where I'm at, like in Austin. And one of the segments we did was a powerlifter reads their DM. So we did that with her. I'm not going to get into it, but let me just say it's exactly.
Oh, no.
And I lost faith, but it's being restored right now because we have a historic announcement. There's no other way of really phrasing it. And I mean that genuinely, because I had a fear. It was my greatest trepidation. Okay. When I would enter a room, it's all I could think about. And do you know what that was, Trex?
Clowns?
I wish I'm weird. I actually find them hilarious. Their misery kind of emboldens me. No. So let me state publicly, I've always really liked Eric Trexler. He's the man. We did that roundtable, right? The pain. What is pain?
I did part of it. You did plenty of it. Yeah.
No, that's sensational. I've always enjoyed your work. It's been top tier. But I'm attached. Nay, I'm stuck together with Eric Helms. And so I have this slight internal conflict, this strife within me that no one could really see. But at night I would attempt to work it out, and it would never resolve itself. But with Helms, because we're in simpatico hosting Iron Culture, and I knew there could only be one error, because as we know with Highlander, there can only be one. I know you don't watch films, it's okay, but basically involves a clash between both of you, and then whoever wins, you behead the other or what have you. You absorb the other's power. And I feared that at one point it would come to that eventuality, and I have to see one of the people that I like and respect go down. Now, because Helms, I squat up, you get with your squat just the way it is, blood in, blood out, Iron Culture, just the way it is. Okay, we don't make the rules. I had to side with Helms. It's the only way I could do it. But in no way, shape, or form would I enjoy seeing the demise of Trexler. But as I understand it today, and I need this to be explained because I understand we had a pyramid before, but it might be closer to like a ziggurat now. It's kind of different. That is no longer the case, and if anything, it's a joining of forces, almost like a fusion dance. Helms, can you explain, Trexler, what's going on here? I just know I'm excited in the good kind.
Well, the timing's perfect because now there is a weed blower right outside my window, just to kind of show that the type of high quality combination of people this is. But Trexler will not be the only one. But Iron Culture, despite being a hierarchical, dual aristocratic, two people atop the pyramid, but everyone's equal, but we're more than equal, very clear structure of dominance-based society, we've now got Connor Heffernan on as our third official guest host, terminology we borrowed from Stronger by Science. And now we're also adding the whole Mass crew on as additional hosts. So we've actually got this, actually you could say, I think any good pyramid, I don't know if you guys would agree with this, should have tiers in it. Now, that's just my personal preference, and if anyone disagrees with that, they can hear from my lawyer. So right now what we've got is we're at the top of the pyramid. That's clear, you and I. And then the second tier, it goes from permanent hosts, lead hosts, whatever you want to call it, to other hosts. I don't know if other is too othering, but we got more hosts is what I'm saying. And we've actually added 4 people to that. We're going to have Lauren Colenso-Semple, we're going to have Mike Zerdos, and we've already got Connor Heffernan. So we've basically got a squad. We got 6 people ready to throw down now at any time with this MASScast partnership, which is what's going to happen, folks. There's going to be a regular episode from the Mass team where one or more of them, today we've got Trexler, joins myself and Omar, or sometimes just myself when Omar says, you know what, there's just too much science in this room. I got to go lift some weights in my cutoff. And we're going to be talking the science, giving you some of the content in verbal format, which mostly is only subscribers only for the Mass website. So yeah, I'm really excited because it's going to bring even more useful content to podcast listeners. And you guys get all cozy with the Mass crew, who I can say personally, with no bias whatsoever, they're the best in the world and they are better than everyone else.
Trex, welcome to the team is what I want to say. Honored to have you.
I appreciate it. Yeah, the whole Mass squad is going to come in and really change some things up, Omar. So I hope that this doesn't feel like a celebration. This is more like kind of bringing in people from the headquarters at corporate to come figure out who is redundant and who is not. I want to begin by criticizing my dear friend, Eric Helms. I've noticed that your analogies are very pyramid focused. I feel like you kind of keep going back to the well there, but I want to help you. That's why corporate sent me. So I've been watching a lot of the Great British Baking Show lately with my wife, and I think you would learn a lot more about building structures if you maybe watch some more baking shows. So there's perhaps like a basket filled with like choux buns, which is on top of maybe like 2 Genoese sponges with a chocolate ganache in between. And then you would just kind of allocate who is which part of that structure. But the pyramid thing over and over, I mean, there are, even if you want to stay in architecture, there are many kinds of structures. Just throwing that out there.
Well, you could take it up with Mexica after you take it up with the Egyptians, after you take it up with my lawyers. But certainly I'll accept for the time being, you can be the chocolate ganache in our basket.
Perfect.
Which I'm very excited to have you as. And I'll just look at you longingly because I'm on contest prep.
So, Trex, I will say this. I want a full introduction just now that we're moving forward, and we'll have that for the entire MASScast of yourself. We've had you, this might be the 3rd, 4th, or 5th time, but I want a proper introduction for you to introduce yourself, as well as we've spoken quite a bit about Mass Monthly Application in Strength Sports. Its research review, its function, how it is honestly, it's peerless in terms of what it does. And that's why a lot of the topics that we cover on Iron Culture stem from Mass and the contributions of both of you and your colleagues. So Trex, maybe let's get a proper introduction of yourself, just because I know we're over 200 episodes in. And as I was talking with Helms, if someone listened to episode 30 and we introduced you, or like whatever the case might be, people might forget. So go ahead, man. Boost yourself up. You've also done the bodybuilding thing too, which is, I respect you guys. I see Helms. His blinks are still good. I know he's deep in when it starts going like this. When it's about a 3-second blink, I'm like, my man is almost ready. But introduce yourself, Trex.
Yeah, I was born on a cool spring morning in 1991 in Ohio. And then 18 years later, I went to college for exercise science. Um, had a background in athletics. When I was in college, got really into powerlifting and bodybuilding. Bodybuilding of the natural variety. I could still fit through door frames very easily. But yeah, I got into that, started competing, went to grad school. And what I used to tell people is everything I studied in grad school, all my studies were about bodybuilding, even if they weren't about bodybuilding. I was just really interested in uh, losing fat, building muscle, getting stronger, all these different types of outcomes in our research. Um, Along the way, did earn my pro card in natural bodybuilding and a completely different endeavor, natural classic physique or classic bodybuilding. I forget which one, to be honest. But anyway, they were very, very different. Yeah. And after that, just kept doing my thing. I've been coaching, making content, obviously doing mass every month. And so with the mass team, I try to focus more on nutrition and metabolism type studies, but every now and then I'll get in there and talk about exercise as well, just to keep people on their toes.
No, it's a great skill set, and it's a very extensive resume. If you didn't pick it up, the man's got a PhD. The man has got 2 different pro cards. He's also done some powerlifting, and so don't let him fool you. He's been a powerlifter, a powerlifting coach. It's a resume that is unparalleled and rarely seen in anyone else without the name Eric or Lane
Or Bo Jackson, the 2 pro card thing.
Fair call.
Yeah, and I should mention, I've been coaching in some capacity since 2009. Basically, right when I was done competing at the age of 18, I said, I want to be a strength coach. So I've worked with wrestlers, football players, Special Olympics powerlifting, virtual coaching for powerlifters, and just kind of general population type stuff. So with mass, the big thing is, yes, we dive into the hard-hitting science. We try to find novel takeaways for people. We also try to defend people from novel things that shouldn't be applied, which is equally important. But we always try to focus on practical application to the extent that we can. So that's kind of a big feature of the whole mass crew, is that people say, who cares about this science? I want the stuff from in the trenches. Well, we do that too.
Yeah, and we'll have that linked in the description as always, because it's something at Iron Culture we proudly recommend. And really, if you're someone that's just interested in learning more about exercise science, nutrition, bettering yourself, if you're an educator, if you're an aspiring personal trainer, it really doesn't matter. It has high utility across the board. And so that's why we once again recommend it. So we'll link that in the description. It's also interesting to me, Trex, because recently we brought up, unrelated whatsoever, the episode that we did last year for April Fools on the carnivore diet. And we brought that up because we were discussing the idea of how to really communicate on certain topics where the evidence is pretty clear cut, but there is a large contingent of people that might feel another way. And how, we had you on there. We're speaking about the carnivore diet. We had you on Ancient Workouts with myself on the History Channel. And I thought you did a phenomenal job. But how, once again, keeping people away from novel ideas, there still was a contingent of people that left comments because it's a juicy topic, right? Where they strongly disagreed. And one of the things they said, and I remember this because we played that one pretty straight. We went right into the evidence. You listed like kind of the research as 1, 2, 3. And the guy just said, I wish they would have actually talked about the science. I was like, this was like 2 hours of like Trex just talking about it. So I feel the resonance for those that want even more information is only going to increase with Iron Culture. So really, it's more everything to this year, Helms. More history, right? So with Connor, more culture, us participating, doing the damn thing, like you competing, and then more science with the MASScast. So it really is Iron Culture to another level, another tier of some sort of structure.
Tell you what, it is extreme Iron Culture is what we're bringing. No, but in all seriousness, I'm really looking forward to this and to kind of set the stage a little bit for today's couple topics. Now is a good time for science. Like the number one podcast on most platforms is either what you probably expected, Joe Rogan, or Huberman's Lab. And that's not an endorsement or a statement about Huberman's Lab, but it's just showing that there is an extreme interest in science right now. And that is exactly going back to what you said, Trexler, where we have to make sure that we're addressing the science interest, both in providing people with the best evidence for what actually has legs in the trenches, but also what might be a little more headline than fact, because science is sexy right now. So on that note, with the little foreshadowing I did previously about BMR, I know there's some content that you've currently been working on in Mass, specifically related to the possibility that everyone's BMR has been precipitously dropping for unknown reasons, probably because of one specific silver bullet in our food supply, or maybe some type of chemical. I don't know what that means, but I've heard that term and it scares me, Trexler. So what is going on? There you go, that one. Alien estrogens. Yep.
Could be.
Aliens. So what's going on? Why is everyone's BMR dropping? And should I go into my underground bunker?
I think those are two different questions. For the bunker, I'd say probably, but I don't think it's totally because of your BMR. That could be part of it. So yeah, recently for Mass, it actually hasn't even come out yet. So this is hot, not even hot off the presses. It is cold because it has not been pressed yet. But I was looking at a new study, and the lead author was John Speakman. And this study was from this kind of batch of studies over the last few years from this big doubly labeled water database. And it's been really fascinating and exciting to watch these studies roll out over the past maybe 3 years or so. Helms, I know you've talked about some of them at length, but there are these studies that are looking at human metabolism in a somewhat novel way relative to how we normally study it. So in a lot of studies, we might look at an experiment where they maybe measured someone's resting metabolic rate and try to make some inferences from there, or maybe they measure their activity level and try to estimate how much energy they were burning on a daily basis. But these studies use doubly labeled water, which is a really fascinating method where they drink this water with a labeled version of hydrogen and a labeled version of oxygen. It allows them to, crunch a bunch of numbers, look at, how these different, levels change over time. They get some urine samples. And what they can do is backtrack because of just how metabolism works. And they can figure out how much energy these people were burning with a really high level of validity and reliability. And what's cool about that is we don't have to bring someone into a tiny little room and just examine them for 24 hours. That's a common way to do it in what they call a metabolic chamber. But Omar, if I just put you in a tiny fake apartment that's not your home for 24 hours, you're probably going to act a little different than you normally act, right? I mean, it's not a prison cell in terms of size, but it's not that much bigger, and so people don't move the way they normally move. Doubly labeled water, you get to look at total daily energy expenditure rather than resting, and this is in people who are going about their day-to-day life. So there's this huge database of all these different studies that people have been doing over literally decades at literally dozens of institutions. They're doing these studies, contributing their data to this database, and it's now allowing some of these retrospective analyses to come out, and they can look at a variety of different trends in the data. So, for example, there was a paper looking at how much basal metabolic rate and total daily energy expenditure tend to vary from person to person and across the lifespan. There are some insights related to exercise energy compensation that have been gleaned. The fact that if you exercise more, maybe your resting metabolic rate goes down a little bit to compensate partially. But anyway, in this particular study, they were looking at data from almost 5,000 participants across this variety of studies in the database. And what they were specifically looking at was total energy expenditure, basal energy expenditure, and activity energy expenditure over the last 30 years or so. So that they kind of had this data over time, and they were looking when we look at these different aspects of energy expenditure, do we tend to see that they're changing, as the decades go on? So that was one part of the study. A second part of the study was actually a rodent study. And it's unclear where they kind of put this in the timeline, if they did the observational stuff and then said, oh, let's figure something else out and kind of threw it in there, or if this was the plan all along to run these analyses in parallel. But they had a rodent study where they had rodents basically exposed to like 12 different diets just to kind of look at some changes in basal metabolic rate on different diets. And they also wanted to kind of double check their first results. So I said originally they had like 5,000 participants from this database. And what they did was they did kind of a systematic review and looked back at studies that measured basal metabolic rate going all the way back like 100 years. Like the oldest study was in 1919. And so what they were trying to do is say, okay, well, we saw some observations over the last 30 years, but does that seem to work looking back at the last 100 years when we include other studies that didn't use doubly labeled water? Because they had some really innovative, and Helms and I were talking about this during peer review, really fascinating technologies, very, very impressive technologies as early as 1920 for measuring basal metabolic rate, but they certainly didn't have doubly labeled water. So with that bigger analysis with like 10,000 people, they expanded that out to other measurements of basal metabolic rate. So the answer to the big question that everybody wants to know, the big question was, does it seem like basal metabolic rate is dropping, or total daily energy expenditure? And the answer is, it kind of depends. Okay, so looking at that first analysis with the doubly labeled water, you could look at either unadjusted data or adjusted data when you're looking at energy expenditure. So unadjusted data is very simple. It's just how many calories did you burn per day. Adjusted data, then you're going to account for things like body composition and age, because there are some small age-related effects on, things like basal metabolic rate, certainly on total daily energy expenditure. And then, of course, body size and body composition matter a great deal. So looking at male data, if you look at total daily energy expenditure in the unadjusted model, the change was not significant. And the same thing goes for activity energy expenditure. The change was not significant. They did find, however, a significant drop in basal metabolic rate. But then when we look at the adjusted model, which you do want to adjust for body size and age when you're doing this. So we can think of this as kind of being the more nuanced and probably more reflective model of real life. All the changes were significant. They found a reduction in total energy expenditure and basal. And interesting enough, they found an increase in activity energy expenditure over the last 30 years, which certainly goes counter to what a lot of us would expect as, a lot of different areas become more and more sedentary occupationally, leisure time. People just generally, anecdotally, don't seem to move as much as we did, 10, 20, 30 years ago. So that was for the male data. And then for the female data, actually in the unadjusted model, none of the effects were statistically significant. And I want to highlight, we're in our world, this fitness world, we're kind of used to, if something's significant, statistically speaking, then we say, wow, that must have been a pretty notable effect, because we're used to studies with like 20 or 25 people. We're talking about an analysis here with almost 5,000 people, right? So to have no statistically significant change whatsoever in these unadjusted models, that's pretty noteworthy. I mean, with 5,000 people, if you've ever worked with epidemiological data, almost everything kind of seems to be, significant. But then you say, okay, but how big was the effect? So the female unadjusted data, no statistically significant changes in these metrics. Looking at the female adjusted data, they found that total energy expenditure went down. That was significant. Activity energy expenditure did go up, which was significant. Basal energy expenditure, it did go down, but that particular measurement was not statistically significant. So, in a nutshell, what they seemed to find was that basal metabolic rates, the kind of key take-home point that the authors focused on, was that basal metabolic rates in this analysis seemed to be dropping over time over the last 30 years. And then they did that follow-up systematic review. And they kind of pooled together all that data over the last 100 years. And once again, the data seemed to indicate that basal metabolic rate was going down a little bit over the last 100 years or so. And so what they found there was about 81 calories per day, I think was their estimate for the drop in basal metabolic rate over the last 100 years or so. I believe the effects were a little bit bigger in the doubly labeled water data, if memory serves. But basically, yeah, what they were getting at there is it does seem that for some reason, looking at this 30-year data and 100-year data, metabolic rate, basal metabolic rate seems to be dropping. And, the total energy expenditure, like I said, it was kind of a mixed bag, whether you're looking at the adjusted or the unadjusted models, male versus female. So it looks like in the adjusted models, at least, total energy expenditure did go down for both male and female. But oddly enough, activity energy expenditure did seem to go up. So that makes a lot of people, it kind of is counterintuitive, right? Because a lot of people say people are gaining weight, obesity rates are going up. It's because people don't exercise as much, and the kind of the common thing is nothing's wrong with your metabolism. You need to exercise more. And when we look at the epidemiological data on physical activity, occupational activity, things like that, when we truly look at activity instead of expenditure as the outcome, we do seem to get indications that people are less active than they used to be. So this data set coming out and saying, actually, basal metabolic rate's going down and activity energy expenditure is going up, that's certainly going to catch a lot of people by surprise. So Helms, another part of your question that wasn't about going to bunkers was, what's going on? What's causing this? And this was a really fascinating one because the authors proposed a potential mechanism, and to their credit, they put every caveat that you're supposed to put, and they said, hey, we're kind of, hypothesizing. We did this rodent study to see if maybe this is going on. So they hypothesized that maybe a shift in the fatty acid profile of the diet might have a role in this. And it was because they found, based on some of their rodent data, that as the rodents kind of shifted from diets high in saturated fat to diets high in polyunsaturated fat, they found that seemed to be correlated with reductions in basal metabolic rate in these rodents. Now, of course, rodent data, not really on par, not at all on par with, well-controlled human data. And so what's really interesting is this research group, I have all the respect in the world for them. John Speakman, specifically the lead author, has written literally some of my favorite papers in all of science. The stuff he's written about the dual intervention point model is absolutely fantastic. Some of his work on the link between genetic roots of obesity and elevated prevalence over time. His work is excellent and super fascinating. The clean cupboards hypothesis, that's kind of a deep track. Not a lot of people talk about that one, which is actually kind of relevant to what we were talking about earlier with Helms's body shutting down in contest prep. It's the idea that when people do severe calorie restriction, there are some consequences of that. The body just kind of starts, doing a lot of catabolic activity. There's some upsides, there's some downsides. And so the clean cupboards hypothesis is why Helms's hair doesn't grow anymore, and also why his immune system probably isn't as strong as it would be if he were well fed. But it's also why longevity seems to increase a little bit with caloric restriction. It's kind of a give and take situation. But anyway, that's a tangent. All I'm saying is I love John Speakman's work, and a lot of his theories are very, very compelling and very well supported by the data. But with this idea that human basal metabolic rate is going down over time because we're eating less saturated fat and more polyunsaturated fat, I really struggle to get on board with that. And in my Mass article, I detail, some of the peer-reviewed evidence for my skepticism. But basically, we do have some of these findings in rodents. This is not new. This idea that rodents tend to be they tend to gain some fat when they go on a high-fat diet with a ton of polyunsaturated fatty acid. But in human trials, when we explicitly try to mimic that in randomized controlled trials, and we'll say, here, you eat a ton of polyunsaturated fat, you eat a ton of saturated fat, we're literally giving you this food and controlling everything we can possibly control. That effect doesn't seem to persist in humans. And in fact, we often see the opposite, usually in some of these controlled feeding studies and in the prospective cohort studies with humans where they say, we're just going to follow you guys over time and see who's eating more polyunsaturated fats. Usually a higher intake of polyunsaturated fat at the expense of saturated fat is associated with either nothing at all or a reduction in body fat, there's some effects on appetite, sometimes an increase in energy expenditure that's observed. So we're not seeing that with humans, more polyunsaturated fat is causing fat gain due to low metabolic rate. In fact, we're either seeing nothing at all or the opposite. So then the question is, what's going on? And I think there's a lot of really compelling theories you can make, and I'm not ready to commit to any of them. And Helms, I certainly, and Omar, everyone's welcome here, but I certainly welcome you guys to kind of chime in as I rattle these off. Please feel welcome to stop me. But just a few things that are worth noting is, first of all, the immune system. It does things, and those things aren't free, right? So one theory is that perhaps human basal metabolic rates truly are going down a little bit over time because we are so fortunate that our immune system is not always attacking something that we don't have a drug for. The idea that we are now, of course, we have more mechanisms to treat things that could not previously be treated very effectively. And the idea that we are, now we have soap and things like that, we're just not exposed to the same number of pathogens. So one idea is that when we look at huge numbers of people in free living conditions, perhaps we're seeing that because their immune system is not being challenged as much and as frequently, we are seeing kind of an aggregate effect of lower basal metabolic rate. That's possible. Another effect of modern life is, Omar, you're in Texas now, but you used to be in Toronto. I assume that every now and then when you felt like treating yourself, you would turn the heat on in the winter up in Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't because I believe you have to be rugged and trained for any condition. But typically, yes, people do in Toronto turn on the heat.
Yeah, people who aren't you. Yeah. So again, thermoregulation has a cost associated with it. And especially when we look at data going back to the 1920s, if you were living in a cold climate, or if it was just a colder part of the year, you were doing things to keep your core temperature high. And that would involve a lot of shivering, probably moving around a little bit more. And another thing that people will do is, you can debate the magnitude and relevance to some extent, but brown adipose tissue tends to be activated in colder, in response to chronic colder exposure. And that's one that always kind of, people will argue that brown adipose tissue doesn't matter that much. But when I was working on my PhD, I did a study where we did directly stimulate brown adipose tissue activity and image it. And the scans lit up like Christmas trees, and their energy expenditure went up very, dramatically because of that acute exposure. So whenever people tell me that, I'm like, they say that because back in the day, it was believed that adult humans just didn't have any whatsoever. And then the imaging got better, and now we know for sure that they do, and we're just trying to figure out exactly how impactful it is, how relevant. But once something becomes kind of scientific fact, so to speak, for 50 years, then it's kind of hard to counteract that when new technologies become available. So those are a couple possibilities. Another one, and Helms directed me toward a great reference that talked about this idea. One idea is, there was an interesting study that was talking a little bit about using core body temperatures as a very, very rough, indirect way to look at total activity levels, right? And so basal metabolic rates, based on this study, seem to be going down over time. Another thing that's going down over time, apparently, seems to be core body temperatures. And there was a study where they were saying, well, if we, look at it this way, when someone is more physically active, we all know about that kind of elevation in energy expenditure and oxygen consumption immediately after a workout, right? If you do a HIIT interval sprint workout, 30 minutes later, you're still burning plenty of calories, right? But even with lower levels of physical activity, we still see some elevation in that kind of post-exercise energy expenditure. And post-exercise, I mean, it's certainly not a linear thing. We see a large elevation immediately after exercise, and it drops off pretty considerably. But basal metabolic rate can still be measurably elevated up to 24, sometimes even 48 hours after an exercise bout. And so there was a study back in the day, I forget what year it was. Back in the day means before 2021. That's my definition. But they basically were using core temperature and saying, well, if we're seeing this elevation in core temperature, it might be indicative of, people doing more exercise and more physical activity. And so on the flip side, one might say, well, perhaps if we buy into that idea of looking at core temperature as a very rough proxy of physical activity, perhaps physical activity levels are going down over time, as some research would suggest, and that what we're seeing in basal metabolic rate is just reflective of that. It is just the small reduction associated with a drop in physical activity. So, of course, a fourth idea that I would throw out is whenever you're looking at studies like this, scientific data are imperfect, right? I mean, there could be all sorts of, and anytime you're doing a study like this, you're bringing in data from a lot of different laboratories, and you're doing a lot of assumption. So for example, there are some statistical adjustments that, if they're just a little bit imperfect, they kind of change the trend a little bit, not due to the fault of any researcher, but statistical adjustment is never a perfect and precise science. And then another thing to keep in mind is when they're looking at, physical activity, energy expenditure in a study like this, they're not actually measuring physical activity. They are assuming that a person has 10% of their energy expenditure is the thermic effect of feeding, and we know that it's not always 10%. And they're also, so what they're doing is saying, okay, activity energy expenditure is take total energy expenditure, get rid of that 10%, subtract resting energy expenditure, which was measured, and that's your activity. And so what we already see there is like 3 levels of assumption kind of baked into this type of approach. So that's not to say it's not good work. I would not say that. I think it's great work. I think this paper is fascinating. But all of that is to say, it's a type of paper that you see the headline, oh my God, BMRs are dropping. And that's fueling the obesity crisis, right? Or the obesity epidemic. There is certainly a lot more beneath the surface that has to be taken into consideration. And ultimately, it doesn't really rewrite the book in terms of us understanding why obesity rates appear to be increasing, and more importantly, at the individual level, what are steps someone should take to prevent or reverse obesity if they feel so inclined.
Great summary. And this was a fun one to peer review in mass, because there were, I had to stop myself from doing the knee-jerk peer review where you see something and you immediately make a comment, because I'm like, I know Eric's going to address this later, because there were so many things about this analysis. I'm like, I just don't buy it. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't comport with other data, and it actually conflicts with our general understanding of what's going on in many of these cases. So to the author's credit, like you, I've really loved Speakman's work. Specifically became aware of him when I, started talking about the dual intervention model, and I wrote that article of Can You Stay Shredded All the Time, and discussing that interaction with other aspects of things like energy availability and REDs and all that. But anyway, I'm not a huge fan of the conclusions of this paper, and I'm even less of a fan of how it's going to be interpreted in some circles, which we'll talk about. But yeah, my first thought is, if your analysis suggests that physical activity energy expenditure has gone up in the last 30 years, that should give you pause.
And it is in the U.S. and Europe, I should mention. Yeah.
Exactly. And specifically in westernized countries, right? And that is something that does fly in the face of a lot of other data. We don't have huge accelerometer trials of people going back 30, 40 years. That's more modern technology. But based upon what we do have, if you look at estimations of time spent doing chores, doing manual labor, walking to places versus driving, all those things have gone up 2, 3, 4, 5-fold in the last 30 years, and even more if we go back to the 1920s. And if you look at, again, we don't have RCTs where we introduce like modernity, but we do have studies outside of these westernized countries. So, for example, in some Polynesian countries that we've actually observed in real time in the more recent era, in the last 20, 30 years, we've looked at what happens to people who have a society that becomes more modernized, if you will, quote unquote modernized, right? And maybe a better way to put it is industrialized, where they're doing less manual labor, they are doing more things with automated assistance, and they're walking less. And what we see is a reduction in energy expenditure. And then the final piece we have, the closest thing we have to inducing like modernity, there were some interesting studies that I found when I was looking at this, where in Australia they have like a settlers kind of like theme park, and it's late 1800s, which is not that different than say 1920s specifically. Australian settlers, and they are actors who live the same lifestyle. They mimic what was going on based upon historical records of what people were doing towards the turn of the century, and just like you'd expect, multiple fold times more energy expenditure and time spent in doing physical activity. So everything indicates, from observational to the only ways we have of inducing this, that physical activity has gone down at the population level, especially in Europe and the U.S. So when your analysis says that, my first thing is, okay, we need to check where these assumptions might be incorrect. And then the second thing that I found hilarious was that you could take the same data suggesting that BMR is going down, and concurrently, body temperature is changing, and you can make the opposite conclusion based upon assuming a different relationship, which was the paper that Eric brought up that I shared that said, hey, based upon these changes in temperature, we think physical activity is going down. So it's really important to understand this study is not actually elucidating a causal mechanism. It is speculating as to something that may not even be real, which is being observed, because there could have been an error in multiple ones of these layered assumptions that Trexler talked about. One thing that you talked about in your paper as well, Trex, and I think I've actually brought it up on Iron Culture before, is that the more processes a food item goes through, the less the thermic effect of feeding is. And if you compare the food supply in the last 30 years, it has become more processed. And it requires fewer calories for you to turn that food into metabolizable energy. And we've actually demonstrated that. There's actually a classic paper where they compare a quote-unquote clean sandwich to like a processed sandwich with processed cheese, white bread versus whole wheat with actual cheese, not a cheese product. And there's a very large difference in the thermic effect of feeding in those two sandwiches. I haven't seen that really replicated very well, but that study does stand out, and it stands to reason that if our assumption of 10% of the thermic effect of feeding is based upon studies that were done in the 1980s and 90s, that may not be as relevant today at the population level when we're talking about people who are eating a processed diet in Europe and the West. So that could explain it. So I think the first step is, do we believe these data? And my answer to that is no. I think we really can't buy this if it's saying that physical activity has gone down, has gone up, and because we know it's probably gone down. And then the next step is, okay, where's the error? But even if we do accept the fact that, okay, let's just say BMR has gone down, and maybe physical activity hasn't changed, but the error is somewhere else, but we can keep this belief to be true that BMR has actually decreased over time, then we get to deal with, okay, well, what's the causal mechanism? And there are just as many possibilities as if we have speculated today, and ones we can't think of. And I think the one that is probably least likely out of all that has been presented is the one that was, put forth primarily by the authors that, it's this omega-3 and 6 swap that we're seeing. And unfortunately, that is exactly the type of information that the keto and carnivore crowd will latch onto and say, see, I told you so. And I saw that and I was like, God damn it.
Yeah.
Why did you do that? Why did you say that in your discussion? Because they're not going to read the nuances. They're going to go highlight, headline, you not eating enough saturated fat and eating too many of these poisonous seed oils is going to destroy your metabolic rate, and it's the cause of the obesity epidemic.
Yeah, I agree. That was, to me, I was just like, we have so many papers looking at the substitution that you would make of swapping in polyunsaturated in place of saturated fatty acids. And when we look at the cardiometabolic outcomes, it looks like a positive shift within certain parameters, right? When we look at changes in energy expenditure, body composition, it just doesn't really comport with this idea that eating less saturated fat is driving, the obesity epidemic. And I think what we are probably seeing one of the things I didn't even mention are two different other alternative explanations. First of all, when we're looking at trends over decades, we're also looking at changes in instrumentation for measuring the basal component of energy expenditure and improved methods for measuring that, making sure that people are rested enough to get a good measurement, making sure that they're in a thermoneutral condition at the time of measurement. So we would expect that the better we get at basal metabolic rate, I would expect that it would probably go down rather than up over time, just by getting better data incrementally over time. Another idea that could play into two different things here is the concept of reverse causality. I don't have enough information to know a lot about the energy status of the participants when they were measured, but when you are looking at a population with increasing obesity rates and a higher public health emphasis on losing weight, there is a chance that more people in your sample might be either currently or recently, losing weight, which of course would drive basal metabolic rate downward. If you're in an energy deficit, that's going to reduce your basal metabolic rate. But the other thing with reverse causality is, a lot of people go into the hits about saturated fat and the obesity epidemic. They do that kind of thing where they say, okay, well, if we just look at the timelines and don't factor in any other data, it's like, here's where people said stop consuming saturated fat, and look how obesity went up and up and up after that point. So we have these two temporal trends over time, and you say, oh, look, correlation, there it is. But, I think that that's ultimately a very insufficient way to look at this particular question, especially when we have prospective cohort studies and randomized controlled trials that we can lean on. But yeah, what I'm getting at with reverse causality is, especially when you look at a temporal trend, as we start to see that, okay, maybe we should, take care of saturated fat as perhaps a public health issue. At that point, things were already kind of moving in that direction. But either way, those temporal trends, whether they're just totally spurious correlations or reverse causation at play, we really need to look a lot more closely before we take, two timelines and say, well, clearly they're linked because they changed in the same direction or the opposite direction. We have to actually do a lot more to figure out if one change truly is driving the other, or if these have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, well said.
Eric, my question is the following. So this author that you both respect, Speakman, this hypothesis that he put forward, and I can't help but feel, quick tangent aside, that the real dangerous path is the following. We know testosterone in males has been declining for the last century. Oh, and it seems like BMR has also been declining. And we also know that the fat sources have been changing. Boom, there you go. They're trying to take our meat away from us. A very real conversation I overheard, and someone told me this is about during the pandemic. Someone basically said, they pointed to the price of like bacon that was increasing, right? And they said, the final world war will be over bacon. They're trying to take our bacon away from us, and I'm not even joking. Right? Like that was it. But the point is that to what both of you said, and that's what we're talking about, like science communication or therein, and like that conclusion, that the tenuous hypothesis they put forth. I think my question for both of you, because this author is respected, and not that it seems like out of left field, but both of what you spoke about either the measurements or just even that assumption baked in that overall exercise activity or physical activity has increased. It is a pretty hard one to swallow, to be honest. Why do you, like, what is the basis in either the research, because this is a person or group participating in it, that would even put forth this as one of the plausible hypothesis for this? Like, where does that come from, you think, from their perspective? Because to like, from what you're saying, it sounds incredulous.
Yeah, if I could chime in, especially when there's a researcher who's done so much work that I really like and respect, and I think like, damn, that's good stuff. I refuse to believe that all this other stuff just slipped his mind. That's not something I find plausible. I think sometimes as researchers, we commit to an experiment and then we have to report it. And I think the fact that they ran the rodent data or ran the rodent experiment in parallel with this other experiment, I mean, it would be, as much as I don't think it comports with the best available human evidence, I also, if you're going to commit to that experiment as a scientist, you're kind of bound to report the results in line with the hypothesis that you're testing. And so if you say, well, we did find something that correlated with a drop in basal metabolic rate, and here's what it was, I also would think less of him as a scientist if he just said, yeah, we did this experiment to follow up, here's the results, but like, I'm just not going to go along with the experiment that I just did. I think they provided the caveats where they said, listen, the human data isn't totally compatible with this. We shouldn't hang our hat on a small rodent experiment with one genetic line of mouse. So they did put in all the caveats, but at the end of the day, it's like, if you test for something just to make sure it's not like with a statistical test, sometimes I'll consult with researchers, and they might want to run a statistical test to rule something out. And sometimes I'll say, what if you don't? Like, what are you going to do with this test? Because if we do the test, then we have to answer the question and talk about it. Like, are you willing to live in a world where this goes away that you're not liking? So like when you sign up to, we're going to do this experiment with this hypothesis, you gotta report it and kind of put all the cards out there once the results come in. And I think the biggest issue there is just a major discrepancy between rodent and human. And they acknowledge that caveat, so I can't really hold that part against them. And then when it comes to the physical activity thing, it's so hard to get at with physical activity energy expenditure when you say, well, then we'll use basal metabolic rate, which has been measured in a bunch of different, tons of different instruments over time with different conditions, which is something that they acknowledged in the paper, which is that as technology has changed and methods have changed, that could be causing this reduction in basal metabolic rate, and anything that's causing a reduction in basal metabolic rate based on this method by default is causing an increase in physical activity energy expenditure, because it literally is just subtraction at that point. So they did acknowledge these caveats. So I think, it's not like one of those papers where you read through it and you say, wow, they just totally didn't get it, and they have no idea what they're talking about. It's one of those things where they got a puzzling finding, and then the question is this a measurement issue? Is it an assumption issue? Is it an estimation issue? Or is this a physiology issue? Or is it some combination? And I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was all of the above, and the physiological components probably have more to do with much bigger shifts in dietary patterns that have occurred over the last 100 years in terms of the level of processing. Especially level of processing and fiber content and just the food matrix that's being consumed. I wouldn't be shocked if the thermic effect of feeding has largely gone down, controlling for macro intake over the last 100 years or so. And then I think the stuff about the immune system and thermoregulation, I think that stuff's also probably relevant to a very small degree. But that brings me to an important point, which is great segue, Omar, that you've set me up for. So let's say, hypothetically, that you see this paper, you don't want to put the thinking cap on, you're much more inclined to take it at face value, maybe because it suits things that you believed before you read it. Maybe. I don't know. I'm guessing. I'm not you. But let's say you're in that position. You want to take it at face value. You want to say, okay, obesity is being driven in large part by a reduction in basal metabolic rate, which is being driven by a shift in fatty acid intake. And, let's say you want to take that and run with it. First of all, the human evidence isn't really compatible. But if you looked at this paper and you said, okay, basal metabolic rate has gone down, what do I do about that? Then you have to say, okay, well, we'll take ourselves out of this paper and look at the other literature. So if basal metabolic rate is truly going down, does the literature suggest that I can then in the future fix it by swapping in more saturated fat in place of polyunsaturated fat? We have to take ourselves out of this paper into the controlled trials, and the answer is no. So that's off the table as what do we do from here? A second question you would ask is, in trials that actually look over time, does low basal metabolic rate seem to predict weight gain over the observation period? Once again, the answer is actually no. So you could say, okay, well, I believe based on this paper that basal metabolic rate is going down, but I cannot reverse that by targeting the main mechanism. And also the idea that low basal metabolic rate is causing a significant amount of weight gain doesn't seem compatible with kind of stronger levels of evidence, not based on, researchers being more skilled, but just on the design of the studies. So we can't really put either of those two observations into action directly. And so then the question becomes, well, then what do we do if we're someone who wants to, like I said, prevent obesity or prevent fat gain or reverse it if we feel so inclined? It's not the right goal for everybody, but some people might want to do that. Then we just go back to the stuff that we've pretty much already known, right? Which is that there's nothing special you need to do to try to supercharge your basal metabolic rate. That's not what we're trying to act upon. What we're trying to do is, the controlled trials on exercise are a little bit underwhelming in terms of the magnitude of fat loss that they cause. But, you want to get a plan in place where you're not being totally sedentary if you're in that position where you want to prevent or reverse obesity. So we're going to talk about getting some physical activity into the mix, whatever you find most enjoyable and tolerable. Ideally, work some resistance training in there as well, because if you're going to have to wear hypothetically like a flannel with no sleeves, you would at least want to fill that out, right? Regardless of what your goal is. Purple flannel if you can get it. But we want to get some exercise in there. And then we also want to just go back to the basics of how do we control hunger, manage appetite, get plenty of protein, and get our calorie intake down to a level that's suitable with whatever our goal happens to be.
Two things, Trex. One, if you did want to get purple flannel cut off sleeves, that sounds amazing. Have you heard any brands that might be a good place to get that?
Mass.
Yeah.
Mass. Hey, I can be honest with both of you. I'm completely blindsided by this episode because when Eric said, we're going to be talking about mass, I went on and got like the sickest pump. And then I just came here literally in a fit of rage, tore off these sleeves. And then he said monthly applications in strength sports. And now I'm here.
Well, Omar, if I could pitch you something, you have a clothing brand, right? Called like Rascal or something?
Yeah, it's RASCAL.
Okay, yeah, it's Rascal, of course, right.
Little Rascals.
Little Rascals, right.
Good movie.
I think, Canadian company, flannel, sleeveless, you got something there. Just write it down. Maybe something to consider releasing if you're a Rascal. But anyway, you don't think so? You know what? I'm a science guy. Don't ask me any more questions. I'll refrain from giving advice where it's not going to be beneficial or warranted. Really outside of my lane. I apologize. Second thing I would say is I really like how you brought it back, Trex, to what do we do about this if it is a thing? And do we need to do anything about it? And ultimately, the answer is probably no, even if we take everything at face value. So I think that's the important thing. I think you're inoculating people against faulty conclusions, in my opinion, unless they are already in a situation, like you said, where they have strong beliefs. They're already doing the thing that they think is best. They're already eliminating evil seed oils. They're already consuming a higher saturated fat and probably higher fat, lower carb diet overall. And then, hey, you're not listening to this right now because you have already given us a 1-star rating because of the carnivore episode where Trexler was the host. and you're not hearing this. You don't agree with us or the data, and that's okay. And we wish you the best. But that might be a good segue into carbohydrates in general. Like, should we be cutting them out? What's their role in performance? Where are we at these days?
That's a good question. So, like you mentioned, my approach with the article that we just discussed is not like, hey, I've got one weird trick that's going to change your life. It's more like, hey, 13 people on Instagram are going to tell you about this one weird trick that's going to change your life. And I just want you to know you can do that if you want, but you really don't have to, right? So like that alone can be a really valuable thing because sometimes things come along and they do matter. Sometimes they don't. It's good to be able to tell one from the other. Now, this, what I'm about to talk about here with carbohydrate is another paper that got a lot of attention and I think really just kind of needed a little more focus in the way it was being discussed on social media, which is often the case. Sometimes, you'll see, and hey, people aren't sitting around reading research all day, right? So you see an abstract, a couple people that you respect also saw the abstract and they say, hey, here's a thing about carbs. And you say, sure, yeah, let's run with it. But this was a paper by Ribeiro and colleagues. And what they were looking at is, high carb versus low carb diets for lifters. And this was a really interesting study in the way it was received because it was one of those ones that I saw people kind of discussing it in both ways. So big. It was like, for some of the findings, it was like, high carb is a little bit better than low carb. And so people on high carb diets were like, see, it's a no-brainer. And then for other ones, there just wasn't really all that much of a difference. And so then people who are on low carbs are like, dude, I told you, lifters don't need carbs. Like everyone should be on keto. It'll make your brain work better and all this other stuff, right? So it was this, and by the way, I don't mean to throw that out there in a way that seems like critical of ketogenic diets. I mean, if the worst thing that you do for your health is that you follow a well-designed ketogenic diet, like you're probably doing pretty good, right?
Uh-huh.
So I don't want it to seem like I'm just like taking shots at keto, but particularly in that world of like performance in keto, there's been a kind of a chorus of people for a long time saying, basically, you just don't need carbs whatsoever if you're a lifter. And so I saw both of these camps using this study to kind of support some of those pre-existing biases. But basically what they did here, it was a retrospective analysis. So there was a resistance training study that was done, kind of a randomized controlled trial type deal. And I think it was 29 individuals. I wrote this a few months ago, but something in the ballpark. I think it was 29. They did a resistance training protocol. The actual training program was 8 weeks. And what was really cool about this study was they did a really cool preconditioning phase. So like for 16 weeks, I believe, before the 8-week training period, they did like a pre-training training period, right? So they got everybody up to speed with the program, which is really nice because it kind of helps you have more confidence that everybody was starting the trial from like fairly even footing, kind of in a similar position in terms of their training status and their recent training habits. But after this preconditioning period, they did an 8-week study, a pretty standard strength and hypertrophy focused training program. Something, if you hopped on this program, you'd be in pretty good shape, pretty well-rounded, good stuff, decent amount of volume and frequency. And they were looking at food logs that were submitted by the participants and kind of saying, okay, that study's done, but we want to go back and look at the food logs and separate these individuals after the fact and say who ate high carbs, who ate low carbs, divide them into groups based on their self-reported dietary intakes, and then say, did one group do better than the other? Can we look back at it and really say that the folks who ate more carbs were better off than the people who had lower carb diets? And so overall, when looking at the absolute changes, and they adjusted for pretest values and change score. They adjusted for a couple relevant things there when they were looking at the raw values. But what they were looking at here, raw values is just like for bench press. Did your bench press go up by 1 kilogram or 2 kilograms or whatever? So they looked at absolute changes and also relative changes. So my bench press went up 2% or 1%, right? So with the raw ones, they're kind of adjusting for baseline. With the relative ones, baseline is kind of part of the calculation because it's a percent increase. But when they looked at these raw changes in terms of like lean mass, fat mass, body fat, bench press, squat, arm curl 1 rep max, the most important 1 rep max you could measure, really nothing going on there. Not much to speak of at all in terms of significant changes. When they looked at these relative changes, again, if memory serves, they did not observe any between group differences for these percentage changes when they were looking at these strength and body composition outcomes. But what you could say looking at it is, if you kind of squint and turn your head a little bit, they seem to favor the high carb group a little bit, especially the one where you see a little bit of a gap is with lean soft tissue. So basically lean mass, fat-free mass. The definitions all differ slightly, but we're talking about putting some muscle on is basically what we're talking about in this type of study. And of course, that's an oversimplification. But so the absolute changes, nothing really going on between groups. The relative changes, again, nothing significant between the groups, but the results kind of leaned in favor of the high carb group. And then they also looked at an analysis of responders versus non-responders. And when I wrote this up in Mass, of course I covered it, but I really didn't put a lot of weight into that analysis because it kind of just becomes a thing where you just draw a line where you say, if you had gains better than this number, then you're a responder. But where you draw that line is highly controversial. There's a lot of argument about how we should go about identifying responders and non-responders. And then if you have someone who is just a touch above the line and just a touch below the line, you get in a situation where one's a responder, the other's a non-responder, and literally any human being would say they had the same response, right? Like, I mean, if you've been in the trenches, your training buddy, if you're a coach, you're working with a team of athletes, if you see people and someone gained 2.1 kilograms on their bench and someone gained, 1.9, they responded the same way. But if you drew the line for responders at 2, you got a responder and a non-responder, right? So I think the responder and non-responder analysis, they did find some some differences between groups that were considered statistically significant, but they had a higher percentage of responders in the high carb group for gains in lean soft tissue and arm curl 1 rep max, but for everything else, the changes were non-significant. So that's kind of the quick overview of the study and results, which would say, okay, maybe high carb was slightly better than low carb, but kind of if you were a low carb advocate, you could totally turn it the other way and say, dude, this was like basically nothing. But my bigger concern with it, no, I wouldn't say concern, the caveats that I would throw in there is that I just don't think this paper actually addressed what people thought it was addressing, right? So people looked at the title and abstract and they said, oh, high carb versus low carb. And I think in a lot of people's minds, they then kind of assumed what that meant, and said, well, I perceive a high carb diet to be, 6 grams per kilogram per day of carbs. And I perceive a low carb diet to be like 2 or fewer, or maybe even ketogenic, right? And so people kind of all made their own kind of mental model of what a high carb versus low carb comparison looks like. And I think a lot of people assume that these individuals were actually assigned to a specific diet. Like, here's what you're eating, go do it. And like I said, this was a retrospective analysis. And what they did was basically cut the sample in half, right? So it was 29 people. I think, it ended up being 15 and 14. I believe the high carb group ended up having the one extra person, if memory serves, but it completely doesn't matter. But basically, there's 15 people in one group, and it was just like, if you're the 15 people who had just above the median, for carbohydrate intake, that's the high carb group. And then anyone below that cutoff line is by default in the low carb group. And so what that means is you could have someone who's, theoretically, the line ended up being 5 grams per kilogram per day of carbohydrate, right? So 70 kilogram person, you're talking about 350 grams per day. So basically, the issue there is you could run into a situation where someone was eating plenty of carbohydrate, 4.7 grams per kilogram per day, and they're in a low carb group. And then you have people making inferences about ketogenic diets based on someone who's eating more carbs than I do when I'm just like chilling, not trying to cut or anything like that on a, just kind of a typical moderate carb distribution or macro distribution. So when you look at the actual intakes of these groups, the averages weren't really that different, in my opinion. And more importantly, both groups, the mean carbohydrate intake was higher than my recommendation for when I tell people, hey, I'm a lifter, how many carbs should I eat? So I usually tell people, if they're like, hey, I'm a lifter, I don't want to leave any gains on the table, I'd rather be safe than sorry, how many carbs do you think I should eat per day? I usually say, at least, 3 or 4 grams per kilogram. 3 would be the low, the kind of number. And then if you can get up to 4, why not? Might as well if you've got the calories to spare. So in this case, the low carb group was averaging 3.8 grams per kilogram per day, and the high carb group was 5.29. And so what that tells us is, first of all, there wasn't really a big gap in carbohydrate intake between the high carb and the low carb groups. There were probably a lot of folks who were in different groups, but were eating very similar amounts of carbohydrate. And the average person in the low carb group was eating what I would consider just like plenty of carbohydrate, honestly. I mean, yeah, even if we want to boil it down, I know grams per kilogram, everyone knows their number for protein, but for carbs, we never really think of it that way. But the low carb group, the average daily intake was 281 grams per day of carbohydrate. And then the high carb group was 381. So, I mean, there just wasn't a whole lot of carbohydrate restriction going on here at the group level. I'm sure there were some folks in there who were on lower carb diets for sure. But ultimately, yeah, my main takeaway from this study was, as I looked at it and I saw how people were interpreting it, I was like, there was a huge disconnect where, there's people who are treating this like it's a traditional diet versus keto randomized controlled trial. And that just could not be further from what it was. And I think it's a really informative study. Like, I'm really glad that they did it. I don't want to, I'm certainly not bashing it or the people responsible for it, the researchers. I think they did a fine job with it. But when it comes down to reading research, we always have to interpret the research in the context of what it really is and what they really did. And so for me, I think the the way I interpreted it was, okay, if there is a number above which lifters have to be, it looks like it's, at least it looks like everyone in this study was above it, right? And so when the low carb group is averaging 3.8, say, okay, so if there is some kind of cutoff number, it's probably below that, if we had to kind of make a rough conclusion out of this. Of course, that was the group average. We have to make it's basically guesswork, if that number exists, it's probably, I would say, based on the research, depending on the type of training you do, above keto and below 3.8, And so then where is it? I'm going to stick with 3 because I already put it in print and signed my name to it. But I don't feel great about that. And I talked about that in the article. I said 3, where did that come from? I don't know. You look at some studies and say, well, these folks did pretty good in this study. These folks seem to struggle in that study. And you have to try to kind of titrate your recommendation based on, it's not like there's a randomized controlled trial that I can point to and say, yeah, if you eat 2.9 grams per kilogram per day, your gains fall off a cliff, right? That evidence doesn't exist. So when I've gotten to the point now when people talk about their, how high should lifters go with their carbs, in a generic sense, if someone tells me 2, I think that's totally appropriate. If someone tells me 4, grams per kilogram per day. I also think that's pretty appropriate. So I don't think we have enough information to really harshly judge someone for where they set that number, but I will harshly judge someone, or uh, I will judge them in an encouraging way. However, I can try to thread that needle. If they tell me that the number that they're giving me is the same for all lifters in all contexts, clearly that cannot be the case. And so in this article, I talked about how I would still say if you just come up to me and you send me a DM on Instagram at Trexler Fitness, it's where all the good information is, and you say, "Hey, Eric, I'm a lifter. How many carbs should I eat?" And I'm not allowed to ask you any questions, and that's all I know. Sure, get at least like 3 grams per kilogram per day. But what ought to happen is, well, what does your training look like? Because if you're doing CrossFit, I'm going to tell you more carbs than someone who is doing Olympic weightlifting, or someone who's on a pretty low volume powerlifting program, and most of their sets are 3 to 5 reps per set. And, so the volume matters. The rep range matters. Someone who's running around the gym doing circuits or strongman medleys, I'm going to give you a higher carbohydrate target than someone who is taking 7-minute rest periods and doing a pretty low volume program with really low rep ranges. So the answer has to say it depends, in my opinion, when you're talking about carbs for lifters. And it should elaborate and say, well, it all comes down to the total amount of fuel that we're burning through in the workout, and it comes down to the energy systems. And that's why it comes down to volume and intensity. And so if I were a lifter who was doing anything kind of bodybuilder-ish or above in terms of volume and, that really kind of circuit type stuff, if you're like getting your heart rate up, to a significant degree, going from circuit to circuit, if you are doing rep ranges that are above that kind of 10, 12 and up range on a pretty high volume program, that's the people who I'd say you probably want to get 3 to 4 grams per kilogram if you can. If someone comes up to me and they said, "Hey, I go into the gym, I do 3 sets of 5 on the squat, 3 sets of 5 on the bench, a couple other little things," at that point, you could go pretty low, I think. I've talked to a lot of power lifters who do quite well on ketogenic diets. And frankly, as long as you're not doing a super high volume program with a bunch of other extra hypertrophy work in the mix, even as low as keto for certain types of lifters is going to be totally fine. It's not my preferred method of dieting, just because I think there's more hurdles than you need when setting up a diet. But yeah, I think with carbohydrate recommendations, Helms, you and I have been going back and forth about this in Mass for years now. Bouncing ideas about what's going on with this glucose mouth rinse data, and what's going on with the acute supplementation with carbohydrate, and what's going on with the total daily intake. So we've been back and forth a lot, but my take at this point is, if you're doing some pretty carb heavy stuff, hypertrophy work and higher on that kind of energy system and energy use spectrum, then I'd say at least 3 to 4 grams per kilogram per day. But there's going to be a lot of lifters who say, "Well, I'm on a low volume program and I'm doing great on 1.5." I'm saying, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. This is an area ripe for conflicting anecdotes, and it's an area where you can take those conflicting anecdotes and you can make meaning of them. And that is that this can only matter so much, or there are some pretty big individual differences. And I think both of those things are true. And those quote unquote individual differences, when that gets thrown out, people often think like these inherent heritable genetic differences between people. But I think many times it is explained by how active are you, how sedentary are you, how long do you rest, and what does the structure of your training program look like? Because one thing is for sure is that powerlifting training is not a ubiquitous term. Bodybuilding training is not a ubiquitous term. And we sometimes assume that we have this more homogenous experience in the gym as a lifting community. But I think if anyone's been paying attention to iron culture for a while, we know there's a lot of different ways to do the whole lifting weights thing. And then there probably are some heritable differences that are out there. So yeah, the anecdotes are, you might just look at it as a scientist. If you got your I want hard data kind of hat on as, oh, this is just a mess and we need hard data. But if you kind of put your coach's hat on and you think, well, okay, well, what does this exclude from being true? Well, it excludes the idea that there is one universal diet or that there are a huge magnitude of differences at the population level for one specific strict carbohydrate recommendation for everybody. So we're either and or looking at small differences and modifying this, or relatively large differences that are very, very heterogeneous between people. And to kind of take a step back and give the listener a bit of a kind of overlook on the landscape of what we have on carbohydrates and all the things that we've covered in mass over the years, we've come to learn some interesting, cool stuff. There's some work that's been done in some of the Scandinavian countries where they're actually looking at specific locations within the muscle fiber itself of where glycogen is depleted and in which fiber types, more fast or slower twitch isoforms, right? And we see that even a submaximal, so say doing like a 5x5 with 75%, squat, deficit deadlifts, and then a little bit of Bulgarian split squat accessories will substantially reduce glycogen in your faster twitch, phenotype fibers. And even though it has a modest overall reduction in glycogen. So some of the concepts we had previously about what depletes glycogen have been turned on their head a little bit. We've seen a lot of comparisons, a fair number of comparisons recently. Vargas Molina comes to mind. They've done a few of these where they've compared ketogenic to higher carbohydrate trials that all generally either lean in favor of neutral to negative for the ketogenic diet, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Oh man, ketogenic, it's really hard to get into a surplus. So when we look at muscle gaining studies, not quite as good. Or, it actually looks like they lost some muscle on this keto diet, but this specific study didn't use DEXA. They used BIA. How much of that is just related to, changes in glycogen influencing what we measure as lean mass? Bit of a toss-up. Or we see these slight, worse performance outcomes that aren't quite significant. There's a study on CrossFit that I'm thinking of. But overall, it's always neutral and negative for keto, unfortunately, if your goals are resistance training outcomes or body composition. And you could certainly spin that as it's just as good and might be a useful way to blunt hunger. That's why they're struggling to get into a surplus on these, keto versus high carb gaining diets. That's not a feature. So it's not a bug, that's a feature in the app, right? And I think that's a valid way of looking at it. So the tough thing is then you go, okay, well, so what should I do? Well, what are your goals? If you find a lower carb diet is easier to stick to and your goal is currently body composition, but fat loss or maintaining a certain level of leanness versus I'm trying to put on muscle right now, then there might be a very different answer. Even in the powerlifting community, I can tell you there's a bunch of powerlifters, especially now that powerlifting is elevated so high. They're an 83 kilo lifter, but they walk around at 85, 86. They don't want to put on any more muscle right now because they can't cut weight very easily. They're basically always, quote unquote, being careful. They walk around at 11% body fat and they're trying to maximize themselves at the top of their weight class. And maybe down the line, it'll be relevant to have a sufficient amount of carbohydrate to gain weight and create the optimal muscle gain environment when they go up to 93, but that ain't right now. And that person will have a very different perspective to a powerlifter who's actively not concerned about their weight class and is trying to move up from the ranks and increase their lean body mass. So you get two different powerlifters, two different ways of looking at it. You get two people interested in body composition, whether trying to put on muscle or maintain a leaner physique and maybe kind of gaintain, if you will, or they're actually trying to, be in a surplus, and you're going to get very different outcomes. So all that data is there, that mechanistic understanding is there, those controlled trial comparisons are there, and then finally, shout out to Andrew King, currently doing his PhD with me here. We've done our meta-analysis where we found that actually, some dose, but it doesn't really matter what the dose is of carbohydrate, either pre or during training, seems to enhance not strength performance, but volume performance, which goes in line with what Trexler said. And when you look at the meta-regression, it seems to be related to how much time has gone by since you last ate, how long is the fasting period before training, and then also what is the total volume. And that seems to be more consistently a finding in leg training, which is, of course, a higher energy cost because it's more muscle mass. So it all makes sense when you put the pieces together, but nothing is saying, hey, and this matters a tremendous amount. So there is a bit of dealer's choice, which I think is always a win. However, as a coach, I have seen some people who saying having some carbohydrate before training means nothing to them. It won't do much. I'm actually one of them. If I train fasted, or if I train non-fasted, unless I'm trying to do a pretty big marathon session, which is just not the way I like to train anyway, it's not going to matter for me. It just doesn't. But I have close colleagues and friends who you skip their pre-workout meal and it's a noticeable decrease in performance and increase in the perception of difficulty. So I think this is one of those things where it's not that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for some, but for some people it does. And then it depends on what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's, oh, sorry. Yeah. I think it's important to just highlight a couple things, and you touched on them. First of all, the one thing I can't get on board with that you find a lot in the lower carb communities is, they'll say, well, this resistance training study only depleted glycogen by 30%, so who cares, right? But like you said, what matters is the specific region in which the even beyond the fiber level, within
Yep.
a fiber, glycogen will be stored in a few different storage depots. And there's this particular storage area near the sarcoplasmic reticula that is critically important for muscular force production and, maintaining high force in fatiguing situations. That gets depleted first. So if you deplete glycogen 30% at the whole muscle level and you say, well, I got 70 left. No, you don't. Not where you need it. And so it's not like you get to zero and then you start to have a reduction in performance. But like you said, even with the keto studies, I think at the group level, we are not seeing huge differences, generally speaking. There's kind of, it depends, for bulking, you could say, keto doesn't look so hot just because people don't enjoy or succeed as much in trying to create a surplus in the studies. Whereas when fat loss is the goal, there might be a slight benefit. But broadly speaking, it's not like, if someone tells me, hey, I want to build muscle on keto, I don't say, oh, that's impossible. You have no chance. The group level average response, the difference is quite small. But like you said, I think when you dig into the individual level, that's where you start to say, well, if we try that out and it just doesn't seem to be going well, we really ought to rethink that. But yeah, I've talked to people who do an exceptional job, whether they're powerlifting or bodybuilding with keto. And so, we should always kind of do that little sanity check with, if the research says something might have a small effect and we see that people can still thrive with it in the real world, then we shouldn't be so quick to say, oh, it can never be done. It's just the question is, what is optimal and for whom?
Yeah. And it's funny, I've used that sanity check both directions. You run into a hardcore keto file and you go, okay, so here's 5 champion natural bodybuilders who are shredded out of their mind and the lowest their carbs got was 4 grams per kg.
Yeah.
And they go, they're on drugs and they leave the room and you don't change their mind. And then, you go to the folks who thinks like, that burns in the fuel of carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are the fuel for everything. Ketogenic diets are going to put you in ketoacidosis and kill you by tomorrow. Carbs are very important. And I pray to the food plate every day. And I dream at night of getting my dream of presenting at the dietetics conference in front of all my peers. That person, you got to go, okay, well, look, like here's all of these athletes on ketogenic diets. And they go, well, they're going to die tomorrow. And they walk out of the room and they don't listen to you. But for all of you good listeners who hasn't tuned out, who is open-minded and can listen to nuance and hasn't already made up your mind, I think those are really useful tools when you get someone who is still in the process of learning and hasn't, solidified themselves into a camp. And they can see exactly what Eric is saying is that these sanity checks are a really useful way to combine anecdotes with science. And that's why I always am bothered, and this is a totally different subject, when people seem to decide that they need to either use in the trenches experience or the research, when in reality, they're both a part of doing a good job as a practitioner, and that they can be leveraged with one another to clarify some of these findings. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I think we've done a great job. We've explained to people that because of their foolish intake of plant-based oils, their basal metabolic rates are dropping, and that is why there's an obesity epidemic. And we've explained to them that carbohydrates are not needed. So ultimately, we just need to go out there and eat the fat of animals on a day-to-day basis, preferably raw, probably, and actually preferably with a knife that you've hunted those animals with, because that makes you just a little bit more manly and connects you with your ancestral past. So I will say two things. Shout out to Saladino, and also shout out to the much maligned and very honest apology, I thought, Omar, when he was sitting on his golden throne, shirtless. Big shout out to, I'm forgetting his name all of a sudden. Help me out here.
The Liver King.
The Liver King. I couldn't remember which organ. I wanted to say the Pancreas Duke, but no, it is the Liver King. You're right. So yeah, shout out to those sponsors for this episode.
Helms, I would normally go along with the joke also about Liver King, but there are so many levels that he went beyond, and maybe the one that irked me the most was his exploitative content with some tribes, like tribal cultures.
Yes.
I'm sure like the way that they eat and just like his dumb hat, everything about him, like this dude needs to be iced. I don't know what needs to happen. I don't know how you're still creating content, and that just goes to show there's always a segment for someone. And I thought both of you did a remarkable job as it relates to the one about the fat intake, potentially the differences with BMR, and now this one when it talks about carbohydrates. One final question for both of you, maybe for Trex then. Just thinking about this, where the distinction between low carbohydrate and high carbohydrate is not how any of us would define the two camps. How many participants, Trex, were in the study?
29.
Okay, so it wouldn't be enough, because I was wondering that, let's say if this study had 200 to 300 people and all the information was available, could you not then reanalyze the data and set different points then, and then have different sample sizes if it was robust enough? Let's say there was several hundred people, like, would that be possible? And not necessarily that it would really influence the outcome to any meaningful degree, but could you do that? Like when we're talking Helms, kind of not like open science, but just the availability of all pertinent information.
Yeah, sure. So if let's say you had a 200-person trial where it was just observational. Let's say you had everybody eat whatever they wanted, right? With some structures that you had maybe a similar energy intake and a similar protein intake, and you let them play with their carbs however they wanted, and then you just simply pre-tested DEXA and 1RM at the end of a, let's say, 12-week period. Then you could break them into quartiles or tintiles or whatever you wanted, 4 or 5, every bracket of 0.5 gram per kg of carbohydrate intake. And then you could look at some findings. Obviously, I would defer to Trexler as to the statistical robustness of such a technique and what kind of adjustments would need to be made, and whether you can truly look at that as a causal inference. Probably not, because that would be like what I would probably call a pseudo-experimental trial, because you're not randomizing them for or assigning an intervention, and there may be other things that could co-vary with why you're on a low-carb diet or a high-carb diet. But absolutely, that would be a useful analysis that would tell you more of, than 5.2 versus 3.8 grams per kg on average, for sure.
Yeah. I was going to say, one thing that, when I was writing the article, I said, even if you didn't have a ton of people so that you could put them in all these different small bins and categories, it's like, even if you just had a big group where you could say, hey, we're just going to throw out the data from the middle chunk, right? So that at least we have a gap, right? So if we said the low carb group is anyone below 2 grams per kilogram and the high carb group is anyone above 5. Now, instead of having this huge intermingled area where people are like eating kind of plenty, but not a ton, now you at least have some separation between the two groups in carb intake, and you can try to make some slightly more robust inferences. But again, don't have the sample size for it here. But one of the challenges there, though, just the last thing I'll mention, is when you do this retrospective analysis, you're not just looking at differences in carb intake, you're looking at differences in people who report different carb intakes, right? And so there might be differences that exist that are independent but related to carbohydrate intake, right? So, for example, one of the things, there might be people who are, they're on a low carb diet because they heard it was the way to go, and they are tapped into a completely different world of fitness information than the people who naturally have chosen to gravitate toward high carb diets. So now you have pretty different camps that differ on more than just their carb intake. And one of the things that came up with this study is when you do this type of analysis, you are putting a lot of trust in those food logs. And so in this case, the high carb group also reported higher calorie intake, protein intake, fat intake. Theoretically, you would have expected the high carb group to have at least lower protein or lower fat, right? Like if you had to guess on the front end. So it's also possible that your high carb group might end up just being people who are more accurately reporting all their food on their logs. And you might have more underreporting folks who are in the low carb group, not because they're on low carb diets, but because they're on low carb, low fat, low protein, low calorie diets, because they're not reporting all their stuff.
Eric and Eric, what a monster episode. I had to wait all the way to the hour and 40-minute mark, but alert, we are here. What can I say? This is the next level, as Helm said. This is extreme agriculture. We're entering a new arc for us. More history, more culture, more science. We're supremely thrilled to have now the MASScast, the Mass Crew, joining us atop whatever cyclopedian structure. We don't need to define it. Typically, myself and Helms will choose a more phallic structure. That's just simply what happened with the pyramid. Why do you think with Connor Heffernan, we said, you're an obelisk, and he said, I'm a what? And we said, just go along with it. It's part of the contract. But Trexler, we are thrilled to have you on board. Where can people find you besides on agriculture?
You can find me at Instagram. The DMs are open. I want to rerun Omar's experiment. Yeah, we'll go through my DMs and see how treacherous they get. But yeah, on Instagram, you can find me at Trexler Fitness. And of course, massresearchreview.com.
Oof. Extremely powerful. We'll make sure to link that. And we'll have a new segment with Rassel called An Exercise Scientist Reads Their DMs. And it actually they're really well vetted questions. And it's just a very informative thing.
No, my yeah, my questions are always like a life summary of every activity they've ever done and their diet history. And then just like, what do I do now? It would not be a funny segment, but it would be certainly interesting.
Quite laborious. No, I want to thank you, man, once again for being on. This has been another episode of Iron Culture. For those listening that made it to the end, you could go ahead and leave a rating and review. We do tend to read them at the start of the show. Typically, people on iTunes, they give 5 stars. We're just merely letting you know that there was that one person who I can assume no longer listens to us, recently gave the 1 star concerning the carnivore episode, which, hey, fair play to you. But we'll do our best to read them, and we'll catch you every single insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.